Hi everyone, it's Jerry here with a video all about learning. We're going to be exploring a quite contemporary account of what learning is and how it operates, Knud Illeris's field of learning model. Now, I find this to be probably the most robust and illustrative account of what learning is, and one that's really helpful for understanding the role that we have as teachers and really guiding our actions with our students in an informed way. So, this is Knud. Knud is a very well respected and prolific educational thinker. He's Danish, although he writes in English. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some of the development of his thinking about learning, because while he's got some incredibly interesting ideas, they kind of evolve over time as he thinks and as he publishes. So where he starts is he starts with a model whereby learning is two different dimensions. There are kind of two oppositional tensions which he puts across two different axes of a model. First up, we have the dimension of interaction. So for Knud, learning involves some kind of interaction between an individual and their environment. And the individual in their environment can be seen as being in some sort of tension. This idea comes from evolutionary biology when we think of learning and the development of organisms in their ecosystems. Organisms learn by interacting with their environment in certain ways, seeing changes in their environment and responding to them in ways that developed an increased understanding or capacity for action. Think of a class of learners in school. For each of those students, there'll be some kind of interaction between them as an individual learner and their wider environment. An interaction between the student and their teacher, an interaction between the student and other students, and maybe also interactions between the student and their desk, their book, their curriculum, the wider environment and ecosystem in which they're situated. For Illeris, this learning through interaction kind of arises often from a problematic or difficult or challenging part of the environment to which learners must respond. So something in the environment creates a stimulus for learning. You might have experienced this yourselves, perhaps when encountering the new environment of online learning and teaching. There might have been certain surprising or problematic differences in how you learn or how you teach online compared to when you were doing that in a more natural classroom setting. You might have had to have found and developed new skills, new approaches to your learning or teaching, or you might have had to think about yourself as an actor in that situation in a slightly different way, i.e. you have to learn to accommodate the new environment. So as teachers, we need to pay attention both to the individual learner and to their environment. We need to support positive interactions between them. You might have come across some of these ideas already on the course that relate to each of these two areas. If we think about the individual learner, we have probably talked about the idea of learning styles and learning differences. If we think about their interaction with the environment, something like Stephen Brookfield's model of authority and ally helps us navigate the particular kind of positive relationship between the individual student and their teacher, which can most effectively produce learning. But that's not all that's going on in the learning process. The second dimension is acquisition. So there's a tension whereby students have to acquire certain kinds of content through incentive. The idea here is that interaction with environment, a stimulus for learning, isn't enough alone. There is another process wherein something, i.e. the content, must be acquired through some kind of effort, which is managed by an individual's level of incentive. To acquire content, positive interaction with an environment isn't enough. Just because you set up the best, most interactive and interesting learning task doesn't quite mean that people will engage with them and really learn in a deep way. Positive interactions are a necessary but insufficient condition for the acquisition of content. In acquisition, students need to participate responsibly in their learning, which is predicated on certain kinds of incentives being present, and these are mostly internal, they're emotional, they're psychological. We're not just talking about rewards, punishments, providing people external incentives to activate their learning. For Illaris as well, content is thought of as very broad. So we're not just thinking facts here, but engagement with knowledge, skills, understanding, and even changes to people's dispositions could be thought of as learning content. Really anything that is required from that stimulus of learning. So, as teachers, we need to again account both for the content of learning, the curriculum and its relevant pedagogy, and thinking about how we can engage individuals with that content productively. And that's going to involve helping people manage their own incentives and motivations. Again, some of the ideas on our course will have touched on these places already. If we think about content, then Biggs and Tang's distinction between declarative and functioning knowledge might be a good way of thinking about it. If we turn to incentive, then you'll probably have come across the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, ways of understanding the different kinds of incentives that students can hold. So you'll see already that there's quite a lot for Illaris going into what learning is and how it happens. But he's going to take it a step further. And if you've got a keen eye for educational theory, or you're good at spotting shapes in random things, then you might well see the triangle that emerges. Haha, it's educational theory, so there must be a triangle in there. If we see it, it's true. There are two really interesting moves that Illaris makes here. The first one is just the idea that if you have these two kind of poles, these two axes, then they form a triangle, and that triangle kind of maps out the entire space in which learning occurs. This is the field of learning, the interplay between those three positions. The second move he makes is by thinking a little bit broader, by recognizing that the work that we do as teachers, the learning that students undertake, is rooted in a kind of wider context, a particular kind of social and cultural background. For example, you might think of the context of BIM in which this course occurs, or the context of higher education or the UK in general. These backgrounds have certain kinds of social aims, structures, injustices even, that are implicit in their fabric. This is kind of what our MA module, Education, Ideology and Society, is all about. It's about looking at how the inner interactions of learning between content, incentive and interaction are placed, informed and ultimately constrained in some way by that outer membrane of society. Just look at how higher education in the UK but globally also is moving towards a more monetized and marketized model in line with wider movements for neoliberal economics. Or look at how contemporary conservative politics in the UK are now positioning teacher education as being about two things. Teacher education is now about content knowledge and classroom discipline. Both of those examples, I hope you can see, are leading to some quite one-dimensional, quite simplistic conceptions of what education and learning are all about. If we take the idea that teaching is just content knowledge and classroom discipline, well, that's just a really thin version of content and perhaps a quite hierarchical, disciplinary conception of interaction. Where is the incentive? Where is the positive interaction there? So hopefully you can see that this kind of model offers a much more complex, more nuanced and hopefully more effective way of thinking about learning. So let's zoom into that inner triangle of learning and unpack it a bit. This is going to be the place where we'll have most power and agency to make positive changes as teachers. We often can't deal with society. So there's a lot to unpack here. If I start inside the triangle in the top left part, as I've said, we can think about content as being more than just factual knowledge. This is about engaging with knowledge, understanding, and skills. So being able to kind of become masterful of things quite a broad way. If we go to the top right, then we can unpack incentive as being about motivation, i.e. a connection to the work. It could be intrinsic, could be extrinsic motivation. Emotion is very important when determining how people acquire knowledge as well. So certain kinds of emotions, certain ways of dealing with emotions are important. Are students confident? Do they feel secure to learn? Do they have the abilities to maintain and manage their emotional energies? Can they deal with difficult emotions and uncertainty? And then incentive is also about volition, which I think unfairly gets left out of the discussion a lot. Volition is a willingness, a kind of up for itness, a willingness to engage, a willingness to go through the difficulty and challenge that learning ultimately brings. Importantly, I think it's useful to think that these dimensions of incentive, we're kind of not born with them. These are fluid qualities and dispositions that can be taught and developed. We can actually work a lot and make a lot of positive impact in this place as teachers. And I think it's useful to recognise that these dispositions, these qualities, motivations, volition, emotion, these aren't just kind of static. They're not things that we're born with. They're fluid. We can develop them. We can teach them. I think there's a lot of positive movement that we can make as teachers in helping students more positively connect with incentive. If we go to the bottom of the triangle, we can unpack interaction as being about an ability to take action. Students acting singly, acting within a group. It's about the ability to communicate with other students, with a teacher. Are these communication channels open? Are they free and transparent? Or are they muddy and inhibited? And interaction is also around cooperation or non-cooperation. Next, we can jump to the outside of the triangle, which is all about what these things are for. So at the top left, content for Illaris is ultimately about building a capacity for meaning to help individuals make meaning from their worlds in more effective ways. And this has a kind of functional purpose. So knowledge, understanding and skills all have a particular function in helping individuals act effectively in the world. At the top right, we can see that incentive is really all about building certain kinds of balance. So for Illaris, it's about kind of having a certain strong centre, a sense of balance in yourself to stop yourself being thrown off when learning. It's about being safe and secure, being able to handle pressure and difficulty. And it's built through certain kinds of sensitivities with yourself, sensitivities to emotion, self-awareness, and being able to kind of navigate yourself effectively. If we jump to the bottom then, we can see that interaction for Illaris is about integration. It's about becoming socialised to be a part of certain kinds of social and cultural worlds. This builds, I think, on some of the work from Lev and Wenger, where they talk about communities of practice, thinking about how certain communities evolve and pass on knowledge. We can think of being apprenticed into a particular community, say of professional musicians, or a community of teachers or of academics. And so interacting within the learning process ultimately feeds that integration. It helps us become part of the wider world. Now, there's quite a lot going on here, as we've seen, but hopefully you can understand that for Illaris, learning is a kind of interconnected field of tensions between some quite different, diverse, yet still interconnected areas. It's a tension between the cognitive, the emotional, and the social. And all three of those areas are absolutely vital for effective learning to happen. If you're interested in these ideas and you want to kind of know more about the theory, you can check out Illyris's work. The 3 dimensions of learning is where a lot of these ideas are contained. As I've said, they've developed a lot over time, and forewarning, some of the prose is quite heavy going. I think there's something about the fact that he's not quite writing in his first language that leads to some quite stilted phrases. But we do have to give him props for the fact that his cover art on both these books looks like either a kind of 80s sci-fi novel or a kind of 90s Doom video game. So really, really good choices there. However, I don't think we need to be masters of the kind of academic theory in order to use this effectively. I do think this is a really useful, usable framework for thinking about the learning of our students, thinking about what we should do as teachers. And as I've said, ultimately I think it's about being skillful, able to operate across different areas of the field of learning. We need to be able to take into account the whole field and help students with their needs across those different places. So we need to attend to the content and the skills we're delivering. We need to attend to the needs of the individuals within the room, thinking about their interests and their motivations. We need to attend as well to the dynamics of the learning group, to relationships within it, to making sure that interaction is positive. So we need to attend to these different areas and make sure that they're balanced well. I don't know if it's helpful, but one of the ways I picture this is by imagining a triangle, let's say of wood, triangle of wood placed on top of a football. And it's like we're standing on this triangle of wood. It's almost like a wobble board. And as teachers, it's our job to balance these different, quite contradictory at times, positions in the learning field, to not make sure that we dip too far and fall off. So using the learning field, I think, is about balance, and we need to balance this in our development as teachers. We need to ensure that we're not overly concerned with one position over the other, that we don't over prioritize content knowledge and neglect thinking about groups and how they process. We need to develop competencies in each of these areas in order to have the skill to be able to respond to situations effectively. So it's kind of 2 things. I think it's about being able to balance these 3 for effective learning to happen, but it's also a stage further about being able to put energy into particular sides of the field of learning. We might get in certain situations where actually things are naturally unbalanced. Say we're working with a group of learners and actually there is something in terms of the incentive, the emotion for one or some of the learners that's just unhelpful. There's negative energy, there's lack of motivation, whatever. We can't just kind of balance normally. We have to actively move towards that area and see how we address it. So we need to be able to identify and respond to specific needs in these different areas, respond to situations to rebalance the board. I think it's quite useful thinking about team teaching actually when it comes to this. As an example, I find myself when co-teaching with other people to kind of constantly be course correcting and perhaps to take up stronger positions in the field of learning than I normally would. I can recall working with a friend and a colleague on a previous course to this, who was quite uncomfortable with theoretical content knowledge. They were very, very skillful in dealing with emotion and also dealing with group process, but they weren't quite on top of the teaching theory. And so I found myself going to that place of kind of theoretical knowledge, of holding the place of kind of critical thinking an awful lot. And I found myself quite awkwardly at that place because I wasn't used to only being there. But the need of the situation in the team teaching relationship sort of called for it, and that was one of the ways that we worked together. In any case, I think it's useful as educators to really, be quite honest in reflecting on our skills and capacities in the learning field. So have a think to yourself, where do you feel most skilled already when it comes to content, incentive, or interaction? Where are you best placed? And where are you most challenged? What do you find hardest? What do you find least comfortable or more intense and more unpleasant? What do you think you most often get from your students in terms of what they need? What do you think the challenges and the difficulties of your students tend to be? And finally, what do you think you need to develop? Where are the places that you need to go to learn more in order to operate across the whole field? What do you need to learn? What kind of places do you need to lean into? Right, so I promise, final diagram, absolutely final diagram. But Illyris goes a final step in thinking about the field of learning, and he actually applies it to the wider discourse of learning theory. So I think this is really cool and particularly helpful. I don't really agree with everything Illyris says here. I don't agree with the positions, but he does something very interesting by actually plotting other educational theorists according to the kind of main centre of gravity of their work, according to the learning theory. So you might be able to spot some people you already know or have come across. In the top right we can see John Heron, who you might have looked into his work on facilitation theory, or Sigmund Freud, or Carl Rogers. All of these people are concerned with people's inner psychological, emotional development and balance in some way. If we look at the top left, you might have come across David Kolb in his experiential learning theory, or Jean Piaget in the way he looked at developmental constructivism. Now both these people are very much concerned with how individuals acquire learning content and make meaning from it. And again at the bottom you might spot Jerome Bruner, Pierre Bourdieu and Gergen, who are all very much concerned with the kind of social element of how knowledge is constructed and how individuals have to navigate social contexts in order to learn. Then if you look at the centre you might recognise Stephen Brookfield, Donald Schoen or Robert Keegan maybe, who are all in some way trying to reconcile the tensions at the edges and trying to help people navigate the whole picture. The other interesting thing Illyris does is these italicised phrases literally at the edges in the middle of the triangle. He's basically making a statement that entire educational disciplines, whole theoretical approaches and movements are in some way trying to discuss the tension and the balance between the corners. So at the top you can see developmental psychology, which is in some way trying to explore how individuals acquire content in relation to their own incentives. And you can see that, you know, both Freud and Piaget were both kinds of developmental psychologists. At the left hand side you can see activity theory is a particular discipline that's dealing with both content and interaction, and at the right socialization theory is trying to address how individual incentives come to inform their interaction with wider social groups and peers. Now the reason I think this is so cool and so useful, beyond just being a kind of interesting thing to look at and think about, is the fact that it can help us pinpoint the needs of our learners and our student groups, but also find out where we can go to find out some more precise and helpful advice. We can actually go to some of these theorists and their work to think about getting ideas and guidance in order to reconcile the issues we find in our teaching. For example, if you find yourself working with a group that isn't quite forming or working together well, maybe some of the theorists at the bottom of the triangle might actually help you explain why that is, or point to some particular resolutions in the group work that might help you. Or indeed, if you're trying to plan out a curriculum well, say just in terms of its content and how it could be best acquired in kind of an instructional sense, then you might look to the top left in order to give you some quite technical pedagogies for the acquisition of that content. You know, this would obviously disregard the kind of incentives of students, but those are quite difficult to know before teaching a group, so you can only take general principles at that point. You can see how we can use this as a framework for thinking about learning situations, thinking about what we might need to know, and actually directing us to go and find some of those answers for ourselves. It's much better, I tell you, than trying to read all of the educational literature in the world at once. As a final recommendation, if you are going to go and do some targeted reading, you can't go very wrong with Illyris's own book. It's an anthology called Contemporary Theories of Learning. What he does here is he actually goes and speaks to still alive, still working educational theorists, pretty much they're all plotted on the graph, and gets them to write their own chapters about their work. So you get some fantastic short and concise accounts from people like Jerome Bruner, people like this, Jack Mezirow, kind of in their own words. You get to hear about their ideas. I'm going to make this text available. You can get chapters of it very easily online as well. This may be useful for you. So, in a rather large nutshell, maybe, that was Illyris's Field of Learning. Hopefully it's given you some interesting thoughts, ideas, maybe, some reflections on where to go next with your teaching. Take care.